or general one, addressing the issues coming out from the sustainability models and how this can be both a threat and an opportunity for rural young people, especially needs in rural areas. If you check our website, you will see that we have been delivering several national reports, policy reports, some manuals for best practices, and we also have a very wide range of publications, especially scientific papers, which have been collected across a number of special issues, such as this one focusing on youth and mobility in rural areas, another one on policy issues and how this has been impacting rural needs, which was published in Youth and Society. And of course, we also have some policy briefs looking a bit more on how our work can impact policies across the different European countries. But you can check and see more on this in our website. Now, we'll go directly for our webinar. So as I said, we have Stephanie Steinmetz with us today. And I will very briefly introduce her. And Stephanie, at any time you can start sharing your screen. But before we go into the details of your presentation, I would just like to tell you that Stephanie is an associate professor at the University of Lausanne and at the University of Amsterdam. Her research focuses on educational and labor market vulnerabilities from a cross-national intersectional perspective. She has collaborated in several European-funded projects and served as an expert on gender for the European Institute for Gender Equality and the Eurofund. And currently, she is the Secretary General of the International Social Survey Program, which collects comparative survey data in over 40 countries worldwide. Her work has been published internationally in several journals, such as the European Sociological Review, Work, Employment and Society, and other journals. And actually, she has also been, she also had the experience of sharing a cost action. So, Stephanie, welcome. This is not a new experience, completely new experience for you. You're in a way reconnecting with cost, and we're very happy to have you with us. Thank you. You're muted, Stephanie, so.
Unmute, yes. So I have to unmute myself. So now I hope everybody can hear me. Thanks a lot for this very, very kind introduction and giving me the opportunity to present the work which I'm currently doing together with Antonella Rocca from the University of Partenope in Naples, Italy. And as Francisco already said, I want to introduce today, I will focus on a particular group in needs, namely female migrants. And I think this talk can also be kind of framed as a plea of including an intersectional perspective into explorations of vulnerability in the area of employment or the labor market or the economic realm, if you want to say so. The background of the paper is actually more related to observations which we did during COVID-19. And here, a recent report by the European Parliament actually is quite obviously stressed that actually, in particular, young people have been tremendously affected by the COVID pandemic and related measures in terms of employment, education, training, but also mental well-being. And this was kind of not surprising if you think about other kind of crises we had before. But when we look at the discussion in relation to COVID, a lot was also focused on older people and the risk of them due to exposure to the COVID virus, etc. So in that respect, the youth angle really came not as a surprise, but still as something which was kind severe and heavily discussed at the European level. At the same time, because we are here in the focusing on need, we also saw that during COVID, at least during the first year, the overall rate of need has increased from an average of, in 2019, it was roughly 13% roughly 13% to a rate of 14% in 2020, so roughly 1% difference. And while this might seem arbitrary, 1% difference, what does it mean? I just want to kind of fill this a little bit with real people, because it means literally that nearly 725,000 more young people have become, entered the need status, which means that they are not in employment, education, or training in 2020. And just thinking about what we know about the literature, what does this mean? There are really severe, economic and social vulnerabilities related to this, which have clearly strong consequences for the future life chances of these people. And of course, the very challenging and interesting question remains whether this is actually an effect which we know from the literature on unemployment, where we often talk about like a scaring effect. So is there kind of a pandemic scaring effect of, this experience of young people in the long run? But I mean, you are probably experts in that respect, but I just thought it's also important just to recall again. So if we talk about need, we talk really about individuals who are not in employment, education, or training, which basically means we look on the one hand on people who are unemployed, but also on people who are inactive due to like sickness, disability, care responsibility, or other activities which basically prevent them from entering the labor market. And you already see this is a quite heterogeneous, very broad concept of including people with very different kind of reasons why they are not actually in employment. And if you look at now the question, who is actually at the risk of need? Of course, there has been plenty of research out there basically showing that the risk is not distributed equally across people. We see that women, migrants, lower educated or low skilled, low SES background individuals have a higher risk of being in need. We also know that the locality plays a role. who in the network basically also emphasizes that it is a difference whether you live in a rural or in an urban area. But also issues like having a poor health or caring for relatives and children are all kind of determinants which kind of heighten your risk of being or becoming need. So while this is all not new for you, I guess, the motivation for our paper comes now in because when we started to explore the literature in this area, it was very interesting to see that women and immigrants have been very often treated as a rather homogeneous group in the literature. And in our understanding, this is a rather problematic simplification because just looking at the demographic changes in our societies, we see in the meanwhile that more than half of the working age immigrants in Europe are actually female. So it seems kind of strange to really ignore that, the composition of our workforce is really changing. And we are not accounting for this, let's say, in our research and, looking more at this difference and the different experiences. And while I'm saying this, of course, you might now think, maybe she didn't do her homework quite severely because, of course, the double disadvantage is a kind of very prevalent term in the literature. If you look at, let's say, more generally, the economic disadvantages of female migrants in the labor market. And of course, there have been studies looking at why do female migrants don't enter the labor market? Why do they have lower wages? But also here, the evidence and the focus is rather limited. So it's not that we have a plenty of in particular, quantitative research, which really focuses on the conditions of female migrants. However, what we saw when studying this more in depth, we saw that actually there is really a lack of a systematic, in particular quantitative cross-national study, which examines more comprehensively the risk of immigrant women of becoming or being in need. And this is kind of the gap or the kind of gap we want to tackle with this study. So against this background, our research question is, first, does economic vulnerability, so being in need, differ between young immigrant women in comparison to young immigrant men, native-born women, as well as native-born men? And did the COVID pandemic impact on this observed gender immigrant gap in need? And in the next step, and I'm not going to talk about this today, is of course also in how far can possible cross-country differences we observe be also kind of related to, let's say, institutional differences in countries, like think about educational system-specific characteristic, but also labor market characteristic. But as I said today, we just focus on a first exploration. What can we find when we look at female migrants in need? And did COVID do anything with that? So this brings me to, let's say, more the theoretical phrasing. So what do we know actually out of the literature? Why are people, in particular women and migrants, are more at the risk of being in need? I think starting with the risk for women, I think what we know from the literature is that even so, we know that a lot of, women have gained in the last decades in terms of equality. We see still that the majority of European countries, they face quite some tremendous challenges in relation to employment. And this is related to different factors, starting with just simply the selection and what pushes women or selects women into employment and in particular jobs. This is classically the stereotypical approach where you think about there are particular ideas in which women are better than men. There is some kind of perceptions from, it can be from the side of the women thinking about what is, the more adequate job for me, but it's also, of course, of the demand side of what are the expectations of employers towards women. But at the same time, if we think about the selection or pushing factors, we also know that a lot of these jobs are often related to, let's say, worse working conditions and job prospects, which in relation to what we know from the literature also enhance the risk of being in need. And finally, there's also, of course, this huge kind of research related to motherhood. So we know that because women have becoming mothers often is accompanied with longer labor market absence, which accumulates in lower job experience accumulation. And generally this big challenge, how can we reconcile work and family obligations? And all this together is again a factor which puts women often, in particular mothers, at a higher risk of becoming in need. And very finally, we also have this whole kind of black box of discrimination, which is of course also a factor which might kind of increase women's risk of being in need. And this brings us to our very first hypothesis that we basically expect what we know already from the literature, that women have a higher risk of being in need in comparison to men. What can we tell about immigrants and their risk of being in need? Also here in relation to the literature, we know that immigrants face major challenges in accessing and progressing in host country labor markets. And this is related due to the different migration motives and statuses they have within host countries, which might basically determine their possibilities of being employed or not, or entering the labor market or entering the educational system. Similarly, we can say that, of course, we know that migrants have often difficulties with the host country language, and as well as with the recognition of their qualifications and skills. At the same time, we also know that discrimination plays an important role, which might, again, similar to women, increases their risk of becoming in need. And of course, then we have a whole package related to the unfamiliarity with the host country institutions and the lack of information about access and support to services, which again makes them more vulnerable and might also increase the risk of becoming in need. So in that respect, not surprisingly, our second hypothesis is that being an immigrant should have, or being an immigrant should increase your risk of being in need in comparison to native. And this brings me to our, let's say, intersectional hypotheses and the question about in how far disadvantages are accumulating if we consider different stratifiers. And this concept of intersectionality, and I mean, I'm citing here Boyd from 84, but you can also think about, like Crenshaw, who also brought this concept up in the early 80s, and Collins and Shaw, who just basically emphasized again that immigrant women face a double penalty. And this is because on the one hand, they are migrants who have integrated into a host country and face the classical challenges related to being a migrant in a host country. And at the other side, they are also being women, and they are of affected by the classical gender biases in society and the labor market of the host society, but also, of course, of the country from where they are coming. So in that respect, this is kind of intersecting. And if we want to understand better, like the risk women are facing in society, and as I said before, in different areas of society, we have to consider that there is this intersecting perspective which we have to implement. And in that respect, and deriving out of our hypothesis 1 and 2, we assume that, like being an immigrant woman and considering the challenges immigrants and women face when it comes to having a higher risk of need, we just assume here that actually immigrant women should have a higher risk of being in need in comparison to natives and immigrant men. So the final hypothesis is related then to the COVID impact. And here, actually, I should already emphasize that this is at the moment more an exploration we are doing. And it is based on the evidence we have seen out of different literature emerging. On the one hand, as I just already mentioned at the very beginning, there have been really reports clearly showing that the COVID pandemic and the implemented measures, in particular related to the lockdowns, has really increased the share of young people in need. And on the other hand, there has been plenty of evidence already now out there, which indicates again that women and in particular migrants have been severely hit by the implemented pandemic measures. And part of it talks about what we call the she-cession, so that in particular occupations and areas of the labor market, women had really struggles in keeping their employment up. And for the same holds for the immigrant side, where also studies already indicate that unemployment rates tremendously increased for immigrants, etc. So in that respect, thinking about, again, our intersection about looking at female migrants and looking at the COVID impact, we expect that actually the COVID impact should be stronger for immigrant women regarding the risk of being in need in comparison to natives and immigrant men. This brings me to the data set we are using. So we use the European Labour Force Survey 2019 and 20. We have 16 countries and we focus on people between the age of 15 to 34/29. And I will say something when I reflect on the findings, because we tried to play a little bit with the age range, also looking at the literature, there is a little bit of broader definition what kind of group falls under younger ages. So we explored two possibilities here, and we excluded people in education and in military services, and we excluded countries with no or very low share of non-European immigrants. Our dependent variable is being in need, just as I mentioned before, and our independent variables are being a woman in reference to being a man, being an immigrant. And here, as I just indicated, we also want to look a little bit at a fine-grained picture between being a non-European migrant and a European migrant in relation to being a native. And then we look at the different interaction effects, basically the interaction between gender and immigrant and the interaction between gender, immigrant, and the year to kind of explore a little bit the COVID impact. We have a couple of control variables which have been kind of clearly factors in the literature impacting on the risk of need. We can discuss it later on if you have any questions to it, but otherwise I will just continue with the descriptive findings because, the methods actually, what kind of methods we are using. So for we apply logistic regression models with country and year effects. We also do several robustness checks. So we try a probit as well as a linear probability model, but in all the different kind of specifications, we don't see substantial changes. And regarding the model strategy, we have four models which we are looking at. The first one basically identifies what we would call the raw gap, including control variables. And then we stepwise include further variables like being a migrant to also examining how and how far can we see that the gender gap is kind of reduced if we also consider migrant background. And then we include successively the different interaction effects. So this brings me now to the exploration and the description. So is there anything we at all have to study? So just looking at the descriptive findings. And here what we display here is basically what we call the gender gap. So the comparison to men. How far do women have really higher or lower risk of being in need across European countries? And as we look at the gaps, so the differences between men and women, everything which is above 0 basically indicates a higher risk of women in being in need in these different European countries. And what you can see that across all the countries, we have a positive value, basically indicating that across all European countries, women are more often in need in comparison to men. And we also see quite some variation across the country. So for instance, we have with roughly 14% difference in Italy to 2% difference in Luxembourg. So we can really see a huge country variation in terms of the risk of women of being in need. Looking at the same kind of picture, but focusing more on the immigrant side. So are immigrants in comparison to natives more likely to be in need in comparison to natives? What you can see here is basically, again, the 16 countries, and we have differentiated 2 gaps, migrant gaps. One is related to European migrants, which is the dark bars, and the non-European migrants, which is the light blue bars. And again, everything which is above 0 indicates a higher likelihood or a higher percentage of migrants being in need in comparison to the natives. And again, what you can see across all the countries, at least for the European migrants, we can see higher shares of them being in need in comparison to natives. And we can also see that for most of the countries, this also applies for the non-European migrant group. And again, what we can also see, like we did for the gender gap, we can clearly identify cross-national variation. So just for instance, if you look at the black or the dark blue bars representing the EU migrant gap, we can see, for instance, that the highest share can be found in Spain in comparison to, for instance, Portugal, where we see a share of roughly 2% of difference between migrants and natives to be in the need status. And this brings me finally to approaching this intersectional disadvantage. And what you can see here are kind of 2 penalties we are looking at. The first one is the dark blue bar, which is a single penalty, which basically looks at, like immigrants versus native born. So what we have seen before. But now, as I said before, it is also important to think about this more from an intersectional perspective. So we also included the double penalty, which is the light blue bars. And this basically looks at the share of women versus native-born men who are in need in comparison to men in need. And again, what you can see here across all the countries we are studying, that in particular, this double penalty is quite severe. If we look, for instance, at Germany, we can clearly see in comparison to the single penalty, we see quite some change in comparison to the double penalty. And what we can also see, so this was the difference to Germany, but what we can also see is that there are country differences. So for some countries, we don't see this very strongly, like with Switzerland, or for Spain, we even see a very small, not decline, but there's basically no really clear difference. But again, I think this is only on a very descriptive level, just making the point that if you look at this more fine-grained, we see again quite strong differences when it comes to the double penalty. And this brings me to the multivariate findings, so being in need. And I'm not going to dive directly into this table, because I think this logouts is often a concept which is hard to understand. But just to start with the very first line, which was something we wanted to stress, so are women at a higher risk of being in need, in the need status? And these are the 4 different models. And the first one just identifies the raw gap, and the final model includes all the interactions we wanted to consider. And just keep in mind, we have here again all the control variables, and we have country and year fixed effects in it. So this is basically telling us, because we have a positive sign, we have the significance level also indicated, that across all the models, we can clearly identify that women have positive logouts of being in need in comparison to men, which kind of confirms our hypothesis that they have a higher risk. And if you look at the interaction, which basically wants to display the, like intersectional perspective, again, just for looking at the science and the significance, it seems that, yes, we are in the direction that, like looking at female migrants seems to increase or have, again, they have a higher risk of being in need in comparison to, and this is now the tricky thing, in comparison to whom. And for this, I jump to, let's say, the easier way of interpreting these findings. And this is looking just simply at the probabilities. And what you can see here is just the comparison between men and women. And we have three groups we are interested in. We have the natives, which is a solid line. We have European migrants, which is a small triangle, and the very fine gray dotted line. And we have non-EU migrants, which is a square and the more roughly dotted line. And what we can see is that, like native men have the lowest probability of being in need, so roughly 15%, followed by immigrant men, which is roughly 18%. They have an 80% likelihood probability of being in need in comparison to the natives. And we can also see that between the migrant groups, we don't have a strong difference for men. However, if we move to women, what we can see is that in particular, European migrants, followed by non-European migrants, have a higher probability to be in need in comparison to native women. So just to talk about the percentages, so the margins basically tells us that European migrant women have a 41% probability of being in need in comparison to native women. And this is just reflecting what we found in the table already, just nicely or in an easier, more intuitive way displayed. This brings me to, now the question, did this kind of difference change during COVID times? And what you can see here is basically the comparison between 2019 and 2020. And what we can see that actually the increase was in particular among European migrants, both for women and men, but that we see in particular for migrant women, we can see that in 2020, the risk of being in need has increased more in comparison to native women than it was in 2019. And this is also the effect we found in the table. However, this is something I want to come to this in a minute. Again, this is at the moment more on an explorative state, so because there are some challenges related to looking at this, and I will come to this in a moment. But for now, we can see in particular for European migrants, female migrants, there seems to be a kind of COVID effect visible. So in sum, so what this paper showed is that women and European immigrants have a higher risk of being in need. It seems that, let's say, the traditional explanations focusing on individual characteristics account not completely for this observed differences. And we also see that the immigrant effect is only significant for European immigrants. If you look at the intersectional perspective, what we found is that, yes, female migrants have a higher risk of being in need, and that this effect is particularly strong for female European migrants. And what we also found is a small COVID effect. But here I have to say the issue is that we find this only for European migrants, and when the age range of need is increased to 15 to 34. We don't find this if we restrict it to 15 to 29. So our kind of interpretation to this is also related to, it might be an indication if we broaden the age range, that this is partly related to women in their prime age of becoming mothers. So it might be related to this kind of motherhood effect as well. Or it might also reflect, let's say, and this is what Francisco and we have been discussing previously when I gave this presentation, that it might also be related to a particular type of migrants. So thinking about mobile migrants who have been basically not able to come to different countries where they might be working in the care sector and so on. So maybe this travel restrictions again increase their status of need. But the question would be then why then in particular if we broaden this age range. But this is still something I'm also curious to hear about, maybe in the discussion later on. Some of you might have an additional idea. Some very briefly limitations, I think, because this has also to be mentioned, it's a cross-sectional sample. Using the European labor force comes also with the challenges that often the migrant population is not as much represented as one would like. So it's a selective sample. And we have seen this in particular if you look at the very small sample sizes of non-European migrants. And regarding the outlook, Antonella and I are currently discussing for the causal effect, especially of the COVID, we have to apply also, let's say, more robust causal analysis models, which like propensity score matching, which kind of help us to approach, let's say, the causal mechanism a little bit more in depth. And of course, what we also want to do, and I didn't talk about this at all, is like the huge cross-national variation we have seen, and which, of course, immediately kind of calls for an exploration of in how far do institutional contexts shape this observed gender migration gap in the risk of being in need. And now I want us to finish this with a kind of takeaway message, because I think in the whole discussion, and this is how I started, is this plea for an intersectional analysis. And I think as an exercise, what this has kind of shown is that we are definitely in need of let's say, an improved European microdata, which would allow us a more appropriate intersectional analysis, which is basically related to which groups are covered and how big are the samples we are looking at. And of course, more substantially, I think we need more analysis to examine these penalties across countries, but also over time, especially if you think about the COVID impact. And let's say on the more political agenda, and we haven't talked about this at all, I think just showing that there is, like a difference between women and migrants and their intersection in, let's say, being in need and the risk of becoming need is something which we should also consider politically, because, like just kind of policies targeting, like unidimensional women in need or migrants in need is something which might not actually work for female migrants in need. And this is something which should be much more also on the political agenda in terms of, effective policy making. And I just want to very briefly give this example of the national recovery and reconciliation plans of countries which are currently discussed at the European level. And I think here we clearly see evidence that the intersectional perspective is often not really considered. So we talk about, generally people in need without, again, having in mind that maybe the policies and measures we are designing might work very differently for them, for different groups. And with that, I stop. Thanks a lot again for listening. And I'm very curious about your questions and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Stephanie. I think it's a great overview of your data, and the second time I'm listening to your presentation, but I do see some new ideas going around the data you have. So clearly, the discussion is evolving around what you have been doing. We are, of course, happy to add your questions to the discussion. You can either just enter the session and add your question, or if you prefer, you can also write it down in our chat box, and we will add your question to our conversations. So I don't know if there's anyone willing to come in for any question to begin with. I have a couple of questions, but I don't know if anyone would like to start the discussion. So while the discussion does not start, Stephanie, I have to admit that after your presentation that I saw in Naples some weeks ago, I was also thinking about the more practical implications of your data. As you know, Antonella, who is working with you, is very, very much involved in a project we are running also on the impact of public employment services on needs, on rural needs specifically. So my question would be, have you been thinking about practical implications for services, and particularly for public employment services, on how they could start to address these intersections between different categories, such as migrants and females. And also a more methodological question. I was watching very attentively your slides when you were describing the double penalties and across countries. But that seems to me like a selection of countries. Was there any criteria for selecting countries? They're very diverse. They go from my own country, Portugal, to northern countries. Could you please just add a bit more of your reflection on how you chose those countries, just with descriptive purposes?
Sure. Thanks a lot for this. Important questions. I will start with the final one because this was basically, as I indicated during the presentation, a choice of, first we thought, great, we have 27 countries. So it's like the European Labor Force Survey covers normally all European countries, plus, a couple of additions to that. So you're first very excited. Yes, you can really cover the whole European area. And then you start looking at your particular variables you're interested in. And then, of course, reality hits. And then you would just see, okay, actually the group I'm interested in becomes smaller and smaller. And for some, they are just basically disappearing because we had a restriction to a particular age group and so on. Mm. So basically, these were the countries where we had enough sample size to do something with it, to have also robust findings in the end. And this seems like an arbitrary kind of selection of countries, which I agree. But again, this is related to the plea I'm making at the end, that if we want to do this properly, if we want to address this properly across countries, we have to work on the data quality, and we have to work on thinking about maybe oversampling particular groups if we want to have more fine-grained analyses. Yeah. And I mean, I'm just saying, I'm aware there is, of course, also the ad hoc model in the European Labor Force Survey, looking at migrants and so on. But again, if you go in this direction, again, you will be disappointed with how many cases and how few countries you end in the end.
So it's mostly the data availability. And
it's the data availability, yes. Yeah. Yes. And related to your second question, or to your first question, I find this particularly important. I don't have here like a question, yes, this is what they should do. If I would have this, I guess I could, this would be great. But I think it's I think a very important aspect is training of people who are in the services, that they become aware of the different situations. And I'm not saying that they are not aware about the situation, but I mean, I just recently had a very interesting talk with a colleague who is now more focusing on how particular actions and measures on the local level, how do they work, and how do employment and services really work, and case workers work. And she was saying it was interesting to see that this is often on a very individual case. So there comes a person, and the caseworker looks at this person and evaluates the situation. And then at this moment, this caseworker just thinks, okay, for you in this moment, the best way would be you go not via this route, but you go via that route. And this, and without maybe thinking necessarily about the long-term consequences. So just giving you the example of a female migrant. So maybe at this moment, you don't just think, actually, this should be a person who should be put on, not on a program bringing this woman towards the labor market, but more providing services in most kind of social services, and not so much like training for the labor market. Mm-hmm. And with that decision of the caseworker, very individually in the moment, a whole trajectory might be passed for this particular woman then in that moment. Yeah. Without any consequence, thinking about that this might have a longer term consequence, that this woman becomes more detached and more less likely to be in the labor market. And I think in that respect, just starting with the training and sensibility of this topic would be a very first step. Probably it is already done, but it might also differ depending on the context, depending on the community, on the program. So I think this is a very important first step.
Thank you, Stephanie. I see that Bianca also wants to come in. Bianca, please do share your question with us.
My question relates to migration. Migration is seasonal for some countries. So they send workers. For Romania is, for example, a sending country. And another migration is permanent. So basically, for seasonal workers, you can't do much to integrate them. But for the permanent ones, you should do a lot more. And how do you see that? Because you have very different migration patterns across the countries. And
yeah, actually, it's this is a good question, and I think this is also again a challenge in the labor force survey, that we don't really can identify seasonal migrants from permanent migrants. We can just assume that maybe on the basis of in which sector they are working. I mean, maybe in, let's say, in the agricultural or where you might have this more often, but it's something which is hard really to determine in the labor force survey. And I absolutely agree that there should be a difference in that, but we were not able to really differentiate this. So we were more focusing on, assuming that this people at least work 1 year in the country, in the host country, permanent, like on a, yeah, I mean, no, we weren't able to really address this properly. And I guess this is something maybe, Antonella, we can also think, is there a way how to approach this more properly? But maybe what the COVID effect I was discussing, what we saw that, this increase of European migrants, higher risk of being in need, might be related to what you just were also emphasizing, if you of a worker who is more mobile in a sense, that going back and forth, maybe this was an indication which we saw as a kind of COVID effect. And what we would have to think about is maybe to approach this more of looking at particular sectors where we know that maybe this kind of seasonal work is more prevalent. Maybe this would be a way of exploring this. But it's a good suggestion. Yeah.
And the second question relates to propensity score matching. How do you plan to use it? Because I know that, for example, for gender, you cannot do propensity score matching because it's an ascribed variable. So you are born with it. You cannot change it.
No, this is true. But what we can do is, because we have 2 years in which, and what we are looking, and we can have a look at, just looking at the risk and how much that the risk of, not the risk, but being in the need status changed from 1 year to the other. So because we have 2 years, we have 2019, and we can compare, and because it's cross-sectional, you can basically see what was the kind of chance of being in need in 2019 for female migrants, and we compare it to people in 2020 with similar characteristics. And due to this, we can look at the differences. This would be the idea. If I'm not mistaken, Antonella, otherwise you have to jump in. This was the idea I had, at least, with the propensity score matching.
Yes, it is a problem of balancing the sample in order to verify that we control for unobserved heterogeneity. This is the motivation we want to apply propensity score matching before the analysis, to be sure that if there is a change, a difference into the 2 years, it is effectively due to the COVID and not to different aspects.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you for your questions. I see that Oscar also would like to come in. Oscar, please.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation, Stephanie. One of the things that caught my attention was Spain on one side, for example, of the gender dimension is one of the lowest, in the middle, let's say, average, together with Denmark, but it's very distant from Italy, which is a Southern European country as well. So I don't know if you can find some explanations for that. And another thing is when we are talking about migrants, immigration, Spain is, let's say, one of the highest, no? And at the same time, surprisingly, with EU migration, right? Mm-hmm. So what explanations do you think behind these dimensions or trends that you see in the data?
Actually, yeah, this is also a good question, and I guess it's something we still have to more explore, because for now the first incidence was really just like, do we find anything if we pool the data and if we look at the countries, aggregated together. And of course, when we show it descriptively, we show this big differences between countries. And as I said before, so this is something we want to do in the second step. So probably at the moment, I cannot really tell you why we see for particular countries particular patterns. But yeah, it is something I think we have to explore more, also related to the context, to the policies in these different countries. And yeah, so I have to kind of tell you, probably in half a year we can tell you more about this. So unfortunately for now, but it's, yeah, I mean, it's interesting to see these differences, especially what you pointed out to, like Italy and Spain being on the very different opposite sides. But as I said again, so probably in half a year I can tell you more.
Thank you. Next time. Yes.
Yeah, sorry.
Oh, it's okay.
But,
understandable.
Yeah.
Antonella, I think you want to add something on this, probably.
Yes, we have not a response for your question, but take in consideration that Italy has a lower female propensity to work, the lowest one in Europe, together with Romania. And this, especially in the gender comparisons, has a great effect and explains why, despite the fact that Spain and Greece has the highest levels of youth unemployment rate, Italy has the highest levels of needs. Mm. Even among, when we look at the male propensity to work, even if it is higher than the women one, but for Italy is one of the lowest ones. So we have a high share of needs.
Thank you, Antonella. I would add to this comment, and this is another comment, that we are more and more having this discussion around youth unemployment, need rates, the fact that it's not so much a case for a strict division between the North and the South and the East and the West. You start seeing different patterns between countries from the same geographic area, let's say, but also some strong asymmetries within countries. So also at the regional level, maybe this is something else that I don't know if it's interesting to explore or not, but I would say that maybe in Italy, maybe it's the case also in Spain, you would see some regions being more relevant for developing policies with this intersectional perspective within. So probably, I don't know, Stephanie and even Antonella, if you want to comment on this, but as I see it, I believe that more and more the unit of references is less and less this division between North and South or East and West, and even less and less the country itself, because there are such big asymmetries within countries that probably we should delve a bit more into the subnational level. What do you think about this?
Yeah, I can only agree to the suggestion. I think this is very important. It's also discussed in other areas, not only with respect to youth unemployment or needs. But I think, again, the issue is, and I can just invite my colleagues in that respect, like if you have very rich national data, which allows you this breakdown, I think this is a very interesting analysis to exercise, like to look at this intersectional perspective. But let's say on a European comparison, I just can stress again, we run into limits. I think it is possible to look at regional level. Yes, it is. but it will be very problematic then, and very tiny groups per region, which makes it more harder to, let's get reliable results. But in principle, I would agree, like a fine-grained analysis on I'm now currently living in Switzerland, which is a very complex country, and every canton has a different policy. And there is really the interest in it, like how different, also even within the country, different policies work. It's super interesting and super rich to explore. So absolutely, I agree. But on a European large scale, I see some challenges emerging.
And in a way, your project is also questioning how much the existing data does already help us to describe reality. So probably that's something else at a higher level that also needs to be addressed. Antonella, I think you want to add something to this.
Just one thing is that we should even control for the different capacity of the different countries and of the different regions to attract the high educated migrants, because there are, if we look at for example, at the level of education of migrants in the different countries, we can see that we have a very different situation, but it is clear because some countries like Norway, for example, has made a specific policy to attract the best human capital.
Yes.
Not in Italy, for example.
Thank you, Antonella. I don't know if there's any other questions or comments that you would like to add to the discussion. Probably we're just summarizing more and more items for you to just complicating a bit more your life. I hope it's not the case, but
no, it's good. This is why we are doing this, to get more inspired. So thanks a lot.
Well, someone will call it inspiration and others will see it as a complication. Let's hope it's only inspiration. Okay, if there's no more questions, I don't see any questions in our chat. Stephanie, thank you very much again for offering this talk to our action. I really do hope that now that it's online, other members will have the opportunity to watch it. And thank you to all of you that participated in the session.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.